Welcome back to the Pushing Through Loss podcast, where we share stories, honor resilience, and embrace strength. I am Kalila Green Siciliano, and it is my honor to begin the journey with you. Today I have with me Michelle, who has reached out and wanted to share her story, and I'm so excited to have you on. So welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
My pleasure. As we were just saying right before we started, it's such an important topic in terms of pregnancy loss to discuss because it happens more often than people think, and it's so rarely talked about that
Right.
to hear where another person is coming from really just helps with the support. It might not be your same story, but it really just solidifies that other people are experiencing this.
Yeah.
So I'm gonna hand it over to you, and why don't you tell me a little bit about your story and what happened?
Yeah. My husband and I got married, and we started trying. I was actually off of birth control a couple months before our wedding, basically thinking we'll just, let it run. And so we can get pregnant right away. We weren't, spring chickens. And, um, and we struggled with getting pregnant, and, not expecting that, not knowing we we're going to do that. And, went and got a diagnosis of infertility with no cause, which is just frustrating. And so we did several rounds of IUIs. I was resistant to doing IVF for a variety of reasons, and finally got to the point where I was like, I'm putting myself through all of this with a very low success rate. So let's just do IVF. And so we did that, and I got pregnant on our first round of IVF. And we were thrilled and, super excited. And then I miscarried. It's just one of those things that, once you say that you've been through it, people come out of the woodwork to tell you about their own stories, but nobody tells you prior to that,
Right.
that like, this is what happened or
Right.
anything. That was just a very difficult thing to deal with. And then we went through, and so on our third round of IVF, we got pregnant with our daughter, Colette. And, I am not a good pregnant person. So I was sick all the time and everything. I always remember, I actually was telling the story recently. A friend of mine met me for lunch and hadn't seen me in a couple of weeks. And she goes, "Oh, you're glowing." And I was like, "That's sweat from this one." Like, nope, not happening.
Yeah, I don't have the pregnancy glow. It's definitely
Right.
from all the other stuff.
One day, if I ever do it, I said that I'm going to I said this while pregnant, I'm going to write a book that says, "Where the hell is my glow?" And that's going to be about it. And then we made it past, scary first trimester. It felt good. When I was 21 weeks pregnant, I went to a standard OB appointment and found out my blood pressure was 188 over 110. I actually had felt the best I had felt the entire pregnancy. I actually felt like this was, I remember that day specifically thinking, oh, this is what they mean by second trimester gets so much better and you have energy, because that's how I felt. And then I was sent straight over to the hospital. Luckily, I have an OB that stays very calm and even keel, so that helped. And I actually didn't know what my blood pressure, they just kept saying it was high. I actually hadn't seen the numbers. And then walking out to the car, like the wind hit and it flew the after visit summary like kind of open, and then I saw the blood pressure and I was like, oh, okay, now we are like, I am really
a
sick,
little high
right?
is an understatement.
Right. And so went to labor and delivery, and was hospitalized until I delivered, is what I was finally told. So that was the evening of May 8th of 2018, and I wasn't due till September 7th. So just very, and one day to the next, I had gotten the evening appointment, the coveted evening appointment with an OB.
Mm-hmm.
And so I had left work and gone to the OB. I mean, I fully expecting to go back to work the next day and all of that. And, really just dealing with that and what, how scary that is. And ultimately was in the hospital a little over 3 weeks before the doctors recommended delivery, because Colette had been small when I was hospitalized. And they were hoping once they regulated my blood pressure, there would be some catch up in growth. And when they did a repeat ultrasound, not only was there no catch up in growth, there had been no growth since. So she was definitely well behind. And they just said, there's more we can do on the outside at this point. So emergency C-section at 24 weeks and 5 days. And, she came out and, started to really defy things. I mean, we were prepped and told over and over again, like, she won't cry, you won't hear her. They pulled her out. They said, it's a girl. The room got quiet again. And then all of a sudden I heard this like really tiny squeak. And I said, is that her? And they said, yeah, but she shouldn't be able to make that kind of sound. And
like
I was
the
like,
best sound in the entire world.
absolutely. We actually have a friend who calls it the squeak heard round the world.
That's so perfect.
And I love it. But it was really, and I just remember thinking, like, of course, it's my badass daughter, right? She's gonna come with all of this,
She's a little warrior, like
fanfare, and she's gonna just, defy odds. So straight to NICU, and she was in NICU, and NICU is my sister was 8 weeks premature, and so my mom was a NICU mom. And one of the best things she's ever said to me in my entire life was, she said, it is a roller coaster, and you're going to start off days thinking it's great, and then end the day thinking the opposite, and then vice versa. And you might go through that multiple times in one day. She's like, you just have to kind of hang on and just, do it.
That's so special that your mom could relate to you. I know so many times people are like, I don't even know where to start. And the fact that you were even that one little inch ahead probably made a world of difference for your mental health.
For sure. And so we would do this, and it was really scary, and she was very tiny. She was just over a pound when she was born, and lost birth weight, as babies do.
Right. But
and
when
then
you're a
also,
pound, that's
they think she lost a little bit more than they expected, and they think that was largely because of the preeclampsia, and that there was just a lot of fluid buildup. And then as she got away from that, I didn't. And so after 9 days, so one of the things that is really hard is with micropreemies, which is what she would have been considered. A lot of times they put them on a very intense ventilator that really works at the lungs and really tries to build them up. It's life-saving, but it's really supposed to be because it's so powerful, it's really supposed to be only meant for about 24 to 48 hours, just to kind of like do that. They kept trying to switch her to the other ventilator, and her stats would drop. So they had tried it multiple times in multiple different ways. And just, we had never gotten to the point where she could get onto the other ventilator. And unfortunately, because she was on that really powerful ventilator, essentially they started, like, her lungs started to almost shred on, and it was just too hard. And so after 9 days, came in, I always remember that day my husband and I had settled into a routine. So he would get up and he would go to work, and on the way to work, sometimes he stopped in physically to see Colette, or if not, he called. And then since I was recovering from a C-section, I was moving a lot slower. I would take my time getting ready. He would give me a call and say, I checked in, and this is what's going on since last night. And I would say, okay. And then I would get ready, and I would head over and stay there pretty much the whole day until he came to pick me up. And when on that particular day, he called me and he said, yeah, I called to talk to the nurses, and they said, hold on, let's put the doctor on the phone. And these are like, right, we know this, right? You get to a certain age, you kind of know this, like, oh shit.
And also, even after 9 days of being there, you already know the routine. And so, when something changes, you're like, no,
that's not right. Yeah. No. And so so I said, okay. And so I got ready as quickly as I could and went straight to the hospital. And there a doctor, came in, and he said, okay, let's talk. And I said, okay. And he said, let me find us a room. And again, right, these are those things,
the red flags that are going off.
And so that was when he told me, he started to tell me this. And, one of the things I feel very lucky that we had a very good experience with our hospital with everything. But one of the things that always does bother me is nobody said the word death. So it was loss, her lungs can't keep up with it. Nobody was
Right.
saying those words.
Right.
And I think that really played into my, obviously I was in denial, like this isn't supposed to happen. But it really played into mine. And I don't think I really understood what was going on. And the
Mhm.
first time I really thought I did was, he said, I think, it's time to call your husband and he should come and, all of that. And he said, I'm going to leave you in this room. You can have it as long as you want. And he
And
like
you're
got
probably
to the
sitting there thinking like, why do I just want to be with my daughter? Like, let me go.
right. And like, right. And so he got to the door, and at the door he stopped and he turned back and he said, do you believe in baptism? And I said, I do. And he said, I think it's time. And for me, that was my like, you baptize a baby because you think the baby's going to die.
Oh,
Like that's
interesting.
why you do it this early.
Right.
And so for me, that was like that was my click of like, oh shit, things are going wrong. I still was in denial the entire day, but so I called my husband, and basically as soon as he answered, I burst into tears, and he took off and came, and I managed to call my sister, who is my best friend and is also a social worker and just like knows how to deal with this stuff and all of that. And she showed up. And then my mother-in-law and my sister-in-law came. And so our rules in the NICU were it was two people at a time. One of them had to be a parent. And so, I was in with my sister. My sister stepped out when my husband got there. Um, and then when I knew my mother-in-law was there, I stepped out and said, like, here, I'll, you go in. And so I was in this family room with my sister and my sister-in-law, both of whom are amazing, amazing people. And, just sort of sitting there. And I was, again, just in denial. And my mother-in-law stepped out and said, do you want to go back in before shift change? And so shift changes, we're not, nobody's allowed in, including parents. And it was like maybe 10 minutes to shift change. And I said, no, that's okay. I was like, we'll go, we'll get something to eat, we'll do things, we'll come back. And so she said, okay. So I think she went back in with, and all of a sudden sitting there with my sister, my sister-in-law, possibly my mother-in-law, I can't even remember now if she was there. She A nurse came in and said, Mom, we need you. And I thought, okay. And all of a sudden, kind of like you said, the routine is the routine. Everything had shifted. So there was no other, like the other parents had left.
Right. Especially if
Um,
it was shift change and you're in there and
right.
you have no idea what's going
And
on.
I'm like, this
I'm not
is
allowed to be in here.
right. And it was just the whole room, like all of the energy had sort of shifted. And um, they came and we sat, and I just remember thinking, it's shift change. We're not supposed to be here. Why are we here? I mean, these are the rules that are dragged into you.
And your brain thinks some weird things when you're in the middle of crisis.
Absolutely. For sure, for sure. And so they sat there, and we just sort of watched her, um
Were you allowed to
and
hold her at that point?
not yet. We do
Okay.
get to hold her, but not at this point. And she was still doing okay. I mean, her numbers were still like holding still. Um and then at some point in this, my sister came into the room, and I remember she was behind me and she put her hand on my shoulder. And I remember thinking, oh my God, now we're really breaking rules. Like
Right now
they
you
allow
got
the
three
third
people in
person
here.
in here. Like, what is going on? Um, and somewhere in that, at one point, we could see her, and the doctor came in, and I saw him shift towards us and to start to open his mouth. And I thought, he's going to ask us to make some decisions right now. And all I remember thinking was, I think I only screamed this in my head. I may have screamed it out loud. I just said, Colette, please don't make me make this decision. And almost instantaneously, her numbers started to drop on their own.
Wow.
And so that's always one of those, like, just as a mom, the gift I got from my daughter was,
You didn't have
she
to
didn't
make
really
that
make me make
decision.
those decisions, because I just, that's all I could think of in the minute was, please don't make me make this.
Right.
And so the doctor said, her numbers are dropping. And I said, yes. And he said, what we can do is we can wait and we can keep her alive. And she can be baptized. And he said, and then we can get a room with all of your family and you guys can hold her while she dies. And I said, okay. And I remember at one point thinking we hadn't called my mom because my mom, who had been very involved in my hospital stay and everything, was a school administrator, and it was they were doing a grant site visit, and she had said, please, nothing today. And that's why I had done it. And so I do remember at some point in this, I saying to my sister, you got to call mom and dad. And, and her saying yes. And I remember her calling and crying on the phone. And I remember that. And so they did. And so we had somebody came in and baptized her. And then we were brought to a family room. And so all three of our living parents and our two sisters and their husbands were all in the room. We all got to hold her. And they came in, and the doctor had to check twice to make sure there was no heartbeat. And so he came in one point, and then he came back, and then he said, she's gone, on the second time. And so, just, I mean, tears and everything, and it's really just, I mean, it's as beautiful of a way of us saying goodbye to her as I would have wanted.
Mm-hmm.
But obviously, like any parent, I wanted to take her home. I mean, that was, what I was doing. And so it's very odd to do this. And I remember at one point, and I don't remember who it was, if it was a social worker, if it was a doctor, a nurse, whatever, came in to sort of talk to us about plans. And I remember asked, do you have a funeral home? And I remember thinking, why would I have a funeral home? My parents are both alive. My husband was, in college when his dad died, and he was like, I don't remember any of that. And he's like, and I think he had older siblings and they took care of it, right? And so I think just like all of it together was really just unsettling. And I am a planner, right? I am the one in the family that like plans all this stuff and gets all this stuff together. And for the first time ever, I found myself just completely lost. And, I still say to this day, like, if my sister had not shown up the day after and basically told us things like, you guys need to go get dressed, and like driven us to like the funeral home and to the cemetery and all this, I don't know that we would have had a memorial for Colette.
Right.
Just because I couldn't even think of what to do next.
Right. You could barely even function to like think about taking a shower or brushing your teeth,
right.
let alone getting a whole group of people in a room to do a ceremony of some sort.
Right. Right. And, really just, grateful that she did that and grateful at doing this. And it's just really weird. It's surreal. You sort of, I remember the day after waking up, my husband and I both waking up almost at the same time, very early in the morning, just kind of naturally. And I remember thinking that was a nightmare, right? Like we just,
right. Like I'm supposed to be going to the
real.
hospital right now.
Right. And I remember one of us said something about that to the other, and it was like, no, it really happened. And just sort of that moment of, oh, that's what happened. And, and I talk about this, I've written about this before. Like, I really like, there's this like split second when you wake up in the mornings as a lost parent. And it's like the split second before you forget, like before you remember everything. Right.
Yep.
And it's kind of like, I wish I could live in that split second.
Forever,
right?
forever and ever. Yes.
And it all of a sudden was like, we had that split second the next day. And then it was like, oh, no, we don't, like, our daughter is dead. And, what do you do about this? And I think it's just very, it's the most isolating experience I think anyone could ever have.
Mm-hmm.
Because, you talked about this. We mentioned this before we got on the recording. We don't talk about death and we don't talk about loss very well. And then you add in it's a baby, and it's like, oh, forget it. No, we don't.
I don't
We
want to
definitely
talk.
don't talk about this.
It's like
You
they
know,
like stick their fingers in their ears almost.
right? And for me, I was very much of the mindset of this is my daughter, and if she had lived, I would have been talking about her, the way a mom does, right?
Right.
So I'm going to keep doing that,
And
and
that time you had with her meant something. That time you had
right,
with her was precious.
right, and I'm going to keep talking about her, and people are either going to have to get comfortable with it or pretend to be
Or
comfortable with it, or they're not really going to be in our lives.
right.
And um, and that was something that I think was, and I think also you highlighted some of the ways in which, my husband and I were raised and other people were raised. So um, I was raised in a very Latinx household. My mom is Cuban. We talk about death, right? We talk about all of that. We talk about everything.
Do you
And my husband,
celebrate Cinco de Mayo?
we don't, because we're Cuban, not Mexican.
Oh, okay. I didn't realize it
Yeah.
was a strictly
Yeah.
Mexican holiday. Because I was gonna say, in that respect, there's very much this
Oh, you're talking
idea
about Dia
that
de los Muertos.
yes, where like you
Yeah.
can
And that
really
is just a Mexican holiday, but I think it's kind of spread way farther than
okay.
that.
Because
But yeah,
you can feel like you're connected in that way, and she's not gone.
absolutely. Absolutely. And that was really much my feelings. And um, my grandfather, who I was extremely close to, died when I was 12. And there are still, I'm 41 now, and there are still moments where I will smell his cologne and sort of feel that presence, or
Yes.
something will happen and I'll feel that. And I'm very into that, and I always have been. And then when it's your daughter, it's like it almost like more so feeds into this, and like
Right.
you just need that
Right.
kind of thing. And so, and I've had dreams with, deceased relatives before and all of this. And so I, very much was like that. And my husband didn't grow up in that kind of family. So I think there was definitely a learning curve for him. And I think
Mm.
something that could only happen with such a close, parent and child bond.
Mm.
But, it was really true. And even in my, my family and my people, there was a lot of like, oh, you're not going to keep talking about that, right?
Yeah, I am,
Kind of
to
thing.
be honest. And I just want
And,
to apologize really quickly for saying Cinco de Mayo and not Dios de los Muertos, because
yeah, no problem. I
sorry.
understand. No, that's okay. I get it. Um, but um, but yeah, so it was just, very, very much learning about this, and really, I think it's one of those tests of like you really realize who's going to show up for you,
Right.
and who's going to learn to be comfortable with it, or be uncomfortable and
And
just push
deal.
through it,
Right.
and who's just going to want to shy away and,
Right.
want you to end. And so, yeah. And, I think, especially with baby loss and even child loss, depending on ages and stuff, there's this interesting aspect because we still very much wanted to have a kid at home. Right. And so there's also that aspect of, and that's why people say the stupidest things like, well, at least you can get pregnant.
Do you know how hard it was for me to get pregnant?
You're like, fuck you.
Right.
Uh
That's not
or
comforting because my child's still gone, but thank you.
right. Or, one of my favorites was, God just needed another angel.
Yeah.
To
Or
which I
God can
say,
only give you what he knows you can handle.
right. The God needs another angel. I don't think anybody in my world will ever say this again, because I actually started turning it around to parents, and I said, okay, so which of your kids would you like to give up as an angel? And then I had people who were very mad at me for saying that. And I was like, yeah, but that anger that you have is the same anger I have.
Yeah.
And when you say that, and so, it's very interesting because you're also still thinking about like, okay, so I do want to have a child that comes
Right.
home. And what does that look like?
Right.
And
And then there's the guilt that comes with it because you're like, if
right,
I have another child that I can raise and give all the love I would have given to my first child, then am I guilty for now not loving my first child? Or
right,
like your
right.
heart feels like it's gonna
And
explode in that respect.
also the other thing too is, and it's something, so long story short, but we have a 3-year-old now, and who's amazing and wonderful and all of that. And sometimes it's really hard because, like for example, he had a lot of speech delays, I think largely due to COVID. He now talks up a storm. And so it's funny because even like last night, I looked at him and I said, remember once upon a time when we were worried about he wasn't going to talk, and now it's like chatter, 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 chatter. But at one point when he was having some of these delays and issues and really just being like confused about things, I remember coming back to this point of like, are we overlooking things because we're just so happy that he's here and he's healthy? And do we have blinders on? Are
Right.
we really seeing this and really having to struggle with those questions? And are we honoring Colette and including her in our family and saying you have a sibling and all of that, and encouraging that relationship in the way that we would have if Colette had lived and they were
Right.
living siblings? Are we doing all of that? And also being cognizant of we can't hold Colette up on such a pedestal so that our son doesn't think he can live up to it.
Right.
And so, those are the kinds of things. And also the grief that still is existing, right? I think there's a lot of, and I definitely heard this overtly and not so overtly. There's definitely a feeling of like, if you have another child, like this cures this grief,
You should be done being sad now. Duh.
right.
And you're like,
And,
what?
or hearing from people, hearing people say, well, you just need to have another child. And like, you're like, yeah, I want that, but this is not why.
That doesn't solve the problem and the fix.
Right. And so, really having to, play that boundary and realizing the grief comes, right? I think of all the things like, we're coming up to Halloween, but like last year on Halloween was the first year that Elliott really understood, trick-or-treating and that kind of thing. And so we're taking him, and it's an amazing experience, right? Like he's having this fun and we're seeing the interactions and we're loving it. And then you like think, but this should not be the first Halloween we're doing with a child.
Right. And also like you should be able to have 2 kids to walk around, and you should be able to think about 2 different costumes, one for a girl and one for a boy. And what
right.
does that mean? And where is that?
And all of that, I think, is really, it's heavy, right? And, for me, I had always envisioned 2 girls, right? And I think it's largely because my sister and I were 2 girls. I think that's largely it. And we are very close, and
Right.
all of that. But, as much as I did not expect to love being a boy mom in the way that I do, and I love it, but I still mourn the fact of I'm not actively parenting a girl, and I never will, because we have made decisions that we are done with our family as is. And that's a mourning, right? Like it's just, it's the continued, triggers and reminders and everything. And it's also parenting after loss. It's not easy because, I do a very big leap from the like slight fear into the most drastic thing.
Right.
And there are PTSD, and I will honestly say I always knew flashbacks were a thing, but I didn't really understand them until, the first time that, for example, one time I went to go wake him up in the morning, and he had like thrown up a little bit in his crib, but he had had strawberries the night before, so it was red. And so,
I mean, that would panic any parent, but as a lost parent, like,
but all of a sudden it was like a flashback as if we were in the NICU again, and all of that. And it's that kind of stuff that, is really hard to do, and that it doesn't go away.
Right.
And, I think that there's this belief that, you grieve for X amount of time, whatever is considered acceptable, and then you move on. And it's like, no, that's not how it is.
Right.
And it's not how I want it to be either, kind of thing. So, yeah.
I want to go back to something you had said sort of at the very beginning of the conversation, because I think that it's an important thing to touch upon. That initial diagnosis of unknown infertility is something that people hear and they think, what do you mean unknown? There's got to be a reason. Can you go back to that moment and just tell me a little bit more about what what the emotion was and what and how you then moved forward saying, because you obviously were then able to get pregnant, but it was through a very difficult time.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I, I've talked about this, and it's like, I think the biggest thing is, right, is we get the societal message of when you have sex, you get pregnant, right? And so like, it's the way that we keep kids from, having sex too soon when they're not emotionally ready and all of that kind of thing. And so for me, I was just like, okay, so now I'll get pregnant.
Right.
And all of a sudden when that doesn't happen, you start to feel like a failure. And really, when there's no known cause, when it's like, well, something's wrong with you, and something's wrong with, with you guys having a child together. We don't really know what, but something's wrong with you guys.
Right. It's where
And
I always go back to that science of like they know so much, but they know nothing.
right. Exactly. Absolutely. And so I think it's very hard, and like infertility is very it's another area, right? And I always think infertility is sort of this thought of as this separate thing, but I think infertility is part of loss.
Mm-hmm.
And there's, everybody has a thing that'll work, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, if you tell people certain things, they'll say, oh, well, you have to try what, my cousin's hairdressers, sisters, whatever. And
You're like, trust me,
everyone has
I've heard it all. I've tried it all.
right.
I
And
got
you're
it.
like, that's great that worked for that one person. I may have tried it, or it may not apply to me,
Right.
right? But everyone has sort of that kind of hope, and they want to share that, and they think it's helpful. And at the end of the day, it's really not,
Right.
right? And I can remember, I sort of think of this, and Michelle Obama writes this in her book about, when they had infertility struggles, that, if you're a driven person, if you've done well in school, if you've done this, like, you kind of adopt the world as like, if I do A and B, it results in C, right? And all of a sudden you get to this point where something that sounds so basic is having a baby, getting pregnant, becomes complicated.
Mm.
You keep trying to find the A and the B to work together to get the C, right? And then you find out that maybe that works for you, but maybe it doesn't.
Right.
And all that. And I think it's really difficult. And I remember at one point deciding that we were going to rehaul our entire diet. That was like going to be my thing. And I remember sitting in the car with my husband in the parking lot of a grocery store and trying to put together my list, and looking at 6 different fertility diets, and looking at it and being like, oh, so this is good. Oh, wait, but this one says that's not good.
Oh.
And this is good. And really doing this. And I just remember finally my husband said, you're going to make yourself insane.
Yeah.
Because, this one says this fruit is good. This one says this fruit is bad.
Right.
He's like, it's fruit. I mean, at the end of the day, like, can we start talking about what you're talking about? Like, this is not, and, that was really eye-opening for me, was to sit there and say, like, yeah, there was never any one thing that was going to cause it.
Right.
And change it. And I think, I had the same sort of reactions after we lost Colette, when I was convinced it was something wrong with me. I was convinced. So it was like, let's find out what's wrong with me and let's fix it. And then this won't happen ever again.
Right.
And I ran around to doctors. I did everything. And we met with a maternal fetal medicine doctor who, really couldn't, walked us through everything, was helpful, but, at the end of the day, didn't really have any great answers to go forward. And, I remember at one point saying, okay, well, what would you do differently this pregnancy? And he said, well, we'll do some extra monitoring, starting at 28 weeks. And I said, I've never made it to 28 weeks of a pregnancy.
Right.
And he sort of looked at me, and you could see this sort of look in his eyes of like, I don't know what to tell you then. Like, this is what we have.
Fall outside my purview, and now what?
Right. Like, this is what we have to tell you. And I understand that doesn't provide you comfort, but this is what you have. And
I picture it like one of those customer service representatives who's frantically searching through their book of like,
right.
I don't know what answer to give them. Somebody help
Right,
me.
exactly. And and he was great, and I'm so grateful for how honest and real he was with me in so
Mm,
many ways. But I remember that point, and I often say, like, this is part of the reason why, like, we need more research on these topics, is
right,
he can only present what he knows.
right,
And that was what he knows. And then all of a sudden it's like, yeah, but I've never made it to 28 weeks. So what does that mean?
right,
And we don't know. I mean, there's nothing that we can prove that says I couldn't make it to 28 weeks of a
right,
pregnancy, but we don't really know.
right.
That's only within what, is currently been researched. And then I I basically made him order my blood tests to check for blood clotting disorders, which was another potential. Um, and when the results came back, remember my sister said, "Oh, did you get the results back?" And I said, "Yeah, unfortunately, I don't have anything." So, and
Right.
she, okay, stop for a minute. And she was
Right.
like, "Think about what you're saying. You don't want a blood clotting disorder."
Right. But then
And
that's an answer.
I was like, but it's and then that's what I said. Like, it's an answer. It would tell me something. It could be
Right.
treated. And she was
Right.
like, yes, I understand that. But if you have a blood clotting disorder, that's something you have to deal with the rest of your life.
Right.
And she's like, and you don't want to deal with that. Right.
Right.
So why do you want that to happen?
Right.
And, and that was really eye opening for me of like, yeah, I don't actually want that. You're right. But in those moments, it was like, tell me any answer,
Right.
anything.
Something you
And,
could hold on to.
right. And, there still isn't any way to do
Right.
this. And, ultimately, we did with our son, we used a gestational carrier, because I was just terrified to be pregnant again, especially because there was nothing really different they were going to do. Right.
Right.
And I kept, saying, you guys are basically saying the definition of insanity, which is to repeat the same thing and
Right.
hope for a different result. Right.
Right.
Wasn't enough for me. And so, that's what we did. So, I still don't know, right? Can I make
Right.
it to a certain point? I have no idea.
Right.
Um, and I think it's just in sitting in that and really recognizing that that is super heavy to
Yeah.
deal with. And
Yeah.
um, yeah.
It's I don't think I read that about you that you ended up having your son through a surrogate because I am also a surrogate. Uh,
Oh, okay.
and so that's why it just it warmed my heart because like I said in terms of science when I was going through IVF for this family, I felt like, wow, this they know so much. Like they can regulate my period and
Right.
they can do this and they can give me this medicine and I can boost my estrogen with that and I can boost my progesterone with that. And the very first round that I had, they transferred two girl embryos and they both didn't attach.
Mhm.
And I don't normally talk about that because it wasn't first of all, it wasn't my baby. And second of all, with that one specifically, the parents were still in that mode of we can't carry a baby to full term. We can't, same as you. We can only get to a certain point and then that's it. And the baby can't survive. And so it was yet another loss for them. We
Right.
then found out there was a whole bunch of reasons why they didn't survive and why they didn't even attach. But in my second round of IVF, they still implanted two embryos and only one attached. And thank God he'll be four soon. And it's one of those where I just the amount of joy it brought me to see this family be able to have their own child, even if it was through a means that wasn't normal, right? Like however
Right.
you want to define that, just meant the world. And when I looked back on it, I thought, yeah, the doctors can do as much as they know, but they know a drop in the bucket of what is
Right.
really out there and what the causes for infertility are and why and the answers are just looming so far ahead. There's really nothing
Right.
else they know yet.
Right. Well, and I mean, similarly, like our surrogate, I mean, was amazing. She's like become part of our family. I mean, I even think like when we were planning Elliott's first birthday and it was in COVID, and so we were just gonna have something very small with just family at home. I said something to my husband. I was like, okay, so just like immediate family, and he said, well, yeah. And I said, well, of course, that I said
She
immediate
is
family.
immediate
This is
family.
her and her partner and their kids are immediate
Right.
family. Like
Right.
of course. And
When
it's
she had
amazing.
your child, like
Right.
that
It's
makes
amazing.
you
It's wonderful. And, I mean, talk about growing your family, right? Like
right.
we didn't just bring home our son. I feel
Right.
like we adopted another family into our fold.
Totally.
And that's amazing and wonderful to see. Um, and we actually tried to do a sibling journey with her again,
Mm,
and there were all sorts of issues. I mean, she got pregnant on the first round, the first time around. We expected that,
mm,
the second time, and it didn't take the second time.
mm.
And then we had several canceled cycles for various reasons and various issues, that really took a toll on us, because each one of those was a loss.
Right.
When it was like, oh, we have this scheduled. Oh, wait, we have to cancel the cycle. It was
Yeah.
a loss, and
Yeah.
it was hard, and it was heavy to weigh on us. And so it became, to a point where finally we basically said we could handle one more obstacle, and then we were done.
Right.
And the one more obstacle was another canceled cycle.
Right.
And we said we were done. And that was, the finality of it. But again, right, we thought we had somebody who got pregnant, who had a very easy pregnancy,
Right.
you know, um,
And at that
so of
point,
course
it's like a double-edged sword because it almost makes you feel because she got pregnant so easily with the first transfer. It was like, okay, well then at least the embryo is healthy, but now where does that leave me? Like that
right,
doesn't help anything. And then all of a sudden you're going through the next ones and you have to cancel the cycle or it doesn't take or whatever it is. And you're like, okay, now what's going on? We thought we had an
right,
answer finally.
right. And yeah, and so, I think there's that. And I definitely, I mean, I'm so grateful that we did surrogacy. And, I'm grateful that I didn't have to go through, um, a lot of what I assume would have been a lot of triggers with the trauma of carrying and everything.
Mm,
But I actually had a very big feeling, a huge feeling of loss shortly after we found out she was pregnant. Like we were
mhm,
thrilled, we were celebrated. And a couple days later, the idea that I was giving up carrying our child really sunk in, and
mm.
was just really like a terrible feeling. And I remember saying to my husband, I think we made a mistake. And he's looking at me like, but she's pregnant. What do you mean we made a mistake?
Right.
Like,
That's a really hard decision to come to now.
right. And just really feeling that loss.
Yeah.
Um, and then for the first time, I surrounded myself with, we found a really good support group who was really good for everything. And all of a sudden it was like, this is very unique, little perspective. And we had met with a couple of different couples who had done surrogacy, one of whom, in particular, had multiple losses. And, they had decided to do surrogacy. And the problem was when I reached out to her sort of for some support, part of the thing was that her experience had been, they basically said, we can get you to, I think it was like, we can get you to 24 weeks of a pregnancy. And that's like all we could get you to. And she was like, I just can't take that risk. Like that's still too early and I can't take the risk. And so she did surrogacy. But nobody had told me that. Right. And that was something else that like, I was like, I want a doctor to tell me you can't get pregnant again or, something. And as devastating as that would be, and I don't know, right? I'm just looking at it from the perspective of I didn't get that,
Right.
but it was like, I feel like then that would even be an answer,
Right.
right? Not a great one, but it would be an answer that I
Right.
could be like, okay, so now I can't. Okay, got it.
Right. Like you
Um,
can sort of say, okay, I can process that emotion and then move forward.
right, right. And so I think that was, also something that was hard. But yeah, I mean, there's a lot of loss that comes with all of it,
Right.
right? I even remember one time saying, the loss of finding out you're pregnant and like surprising your partner, I didn't have that because we went
Right.
through IVF where you
Right.
get a phone call and when you're getting a phone call. And I'm like, so then we were both waiting for with bated breath, and I would get the phone call and then I would like call him,
Right.
if he wasn't like with me, depending on when the testing
Right.
came up. Like, that's a loss, right? And
Right.
it seems like it's the loss of like, I had a classical C-section, which means I can't go into labor because I could burst things. So it was like the loss of the experience of labor, right? And
Right.
like people look at me and say, that's crazy. That like, nobody wants to go through this. And I'm like, yeah, but you have a
But to be
choice,
told you can't makes a big
right?
difference.
Exactly. And to be told you can't, not because, right. I've had a number of friends who, have breech babies or, this and that, not because of any of that, but
Right.
because something happened that was a huge loss for you.
Right.
And now you can't ever do this ever again.
Right.
And that's heavy. And
Yeah.
that's a really difficult loss.
Yeah.
Um, and so, I say this is like all these other losses that come with it all the time,
Yeah.
and that's really tough to deal with.
Yeah.
And,
I
yeah,
do want to ask you because I think that it's really important for people who are going through something like this to know what did help on the other side of grief, because grief, like you said, it's always going to be there and it's just in different forms, and sometimes it's more present and sometimes it's a little bit duller. But tell me some of the things, maybe, I don't know, three things or so that you can say that really, right there, I can point to a specific solution in terms of my emotion and my mental health.
right. I would say therapy was a big one.
Mm,
Especially I was fortunate to have a therapist before all this happened who
mm,
had specialty in grief. And I think that's really helpful. And finding that perfect fit
mm,
is great. I think so I think that that's one thing. I think that support groups and finding people who have gone through similar situations is so incredibly helpful.
mm,
And so I would recommend that. And then I think it's, figuring out, and it's different for everybody on this, what you can sort of channel your grief into. And
mm,
so for me, it was, we started a nonprofit in Colette's honor and memory. And so setting that up and doing that work, to this day is very helpful. And it
mm,
keeps Colette, close to me.
mm,
And, and it also makes meaning out of her life. And, I think for other people, it's volunteering and doing stuff. It's, whatever it is. And it, like I said, it's different for everybody. It's
right.
writing about it. It's all of that. So I think it's finding your thing, right? And
Mm,
it just depends on your personality and what you like doing, what you're good at doing. And really, carrying that out and doing that in such
right.
a way that it really, feels like you were processing through the grief
Yeah.
and doing that.
Yeah.
Um, and yeah, and then I think it's the other thing I would say is surrounding yourself with those who are going to be supportive and are going to be helpful. And it may mean kind of removing people from your life.
Yeah.
And that's really hard. And again, that's another loss, right?
Right.
I have a very good friend. We were friends for many years who just didn't really show up for me.
Mm,
And that was hard. And I haven't talked to her in a while.
right.
And, it's a hard thing to deal with, but
Right.
it is what it was. And
Right. It's just
that kind of,
another loss to add to everything else.
right. Yeah.
Yeah. My therapist talks about that, where, because I agree with you in finding somebody that understands what you're going through. My therapist, his wife had a stillbirth at 32 weeks. So he definitely understood every aspect of pregnancy loss and infant loss. And he had told us, it was a single therapy sessions that I did, and then it was also a group therapy session with other couples that had gone through pregnancy loss and infant loss. And he had said his best friend and his wife, of all people, didn't show up to his daughter's funeral. And he was like, that in and of itself, he couldn't tell you everything that happened that day. He couldn't tell you what he ate for like weeks afterwards, but he could tell you who he saw and who he didn't see and who wrote him an email or a card or reached out. And he was like, that hurt almost as much as losing my child, because of the fact that I thought that this person would be there for me and yet couldn't deal with their own emotions when I was
Right.
going through such a hard time.
Right. And I think, it's very true. Like I think of, who showed up, and I remember one of Mark's best friends, and, we're friends with the couple, and she and I do friends. He had just started like a brand new job after having been laid off and been laid off for a good amount of time.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a big conference that was happening when the memorial happened.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember us telling him, it's okay if you don't come, like we
Right.
understand. And he said, no, this is where I need to be. and he like took a red eye and came.
Aww.
And I said, yeah, but what if they like have a problem with you doing this? And he said, then this is not the place I should be working at
That's
if they do.
beautiful.
And, and I remember thinking that was so amazing to me that you put a priority on us and you realize that. And we weren't even like, we would not have been offended if he would have
Right. That was
not
one of
talked.
those situations you
And
totally understood.
right. And I just remember they're saying, I really thank you for coming. And he said, this is where I'm supposed to be. And just that simple of a statement of
Right.
this is where I'm supposed to be.
Right.
And,
That's
it
amazing.
solidified, our friendship with them and really
Yeah.
just felt, the good place. And, and I always encourage people, if you haven't done it and, you think too much time has gone by, still reach out,
Yeah.
apologize, fall on your sword. I mean, we had friends who he sent us a message, probably 6 months later and said, I screwed up. I didn't know what to say in the beginning. And so I kind of waited to see if I could figure out what to say. And then he said, and then a lot more time went by. And then I was like, do I reach out? And then finally he was like, listen, you guys could never speak to me again. And like, I would totally respect that. I would acknowledge that. But I just want to say, like, I really screwed up as a friend and I'm really sorry.
Yeah.
And that sincerity, like, I feel like that made our friendship stronger.
Yeah.
And now, like, I feel like they're one of our biggest like cheerleaders with everything. I mean, they're just really supportive. And that came out of that vulnerability
Right.
that was saying, I screwed up
Right.
and this is what it is.
Yeah.
So I always encourage people, even if it's been a long time, reach out. It does, even if it doesn't fix a relationship, I think it goes a long way to
Yeah.
just saying,
I'm
okay.
sorry. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, your story is heartbreaking, but also so inspiring because of where you are now and what you've
Mhm.
created in Colette's honor. Tell people where they can find you and where they can find the organization that you created in her memory. And I'll
Yeah.
have all of that in the show notes also.
Yeah. So it's the Colette Louise Tisdall Foundation. So it's Colette, 1L, 2T's, Louise.com. And then we're on all of like Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn, all of that.
Perfect. Just send me all of those links and we'll put them in the show
Yep.
notes.
Sounds great.
Perfect. Michelle, I can't even express how grateful I am that you were willing to share and that you really allowed people to see into a world that, like we said, is so often not spoken about and so often tried to like bury deep so that other people don't have to feel our pain.
Right.
But to be able to have the people who are going through it allow that space to say I'm not alone, it's I have no words.
Yeah. Yeah. No, for sure. Yeah. I think it's just something we need to talk about,
Yeah.
because I honestly, I don't think I've had any sort of meeting in over 5 years of running an organization where somebody didn't either disclose their own loss, somebody's loss really close to them, something like that. I don't think I've had
Yeah.
one meeting.
Yeah.
And if I don't get a loss in a meeting, then I get like a NICU experience or high risk pregnancy or
Right.
something. So sort of in the same venue. And so
Right.
I think that's really just, that reminds me, that always keeps reminding me that like, this is really important. We need to be talking about it.
Yeah.
So
And the more that's out there, the better, because it just helps people know that there's more resources. There's
right.
so much for pregnancy and health and making sure that the mom is okay, making sure that the baby's okay, making sure that once your baby is born that everything's okay. And here's this resource and that resource. And what do I do for getting them to sleep through the night and all those things. And yet when you're faced with a loss, you go, now what? What
Right.
resource is there for me? Who can I talk to? Who can listen? Who can just sit there with me? So thank you so much. And I am excited to see what else we can do together. And I'm so grateful to have met you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you for joining me today on Pushing Through Loss. I hope this episode has provided support, understanding, and a sense of community for those who've experienced pregnancy loss. Remember, you are not alone in your journey, and there is strength within you to face the challenges that come your way. If you found value in today's episode, please consider sharing it with others who may benefit. Together, we can help each other heal and activate our inner strength warriors. Stay tuned for more empowering conversations, and until next time, you got this.